The laughter started quietly at first, the kind that pretends not to be laughter at all. A smirk here, a sideways glance there, boots scuffing the dirt as men tried not to stare too long at the rifle resting across his knees. It looked out of place among the others, lighter, slimmer, lacking the heavy authority of stander, tissue steel. Someone finally said it out loud, low but sharp enough to cut through the morning air, a mail order gun. The words drifted like smoke and settled on him. He did not respond. He only ran a cloth along the barrel, slow and methodical, as if the jungle itself were listening and he did not wish to offend it. The island was quiet in that uneasy way that never meant peace. Even the birds seemed cautious, calling only when the wind masked their voices. The men had learned this silence well. It came before the shot you never heard, before the sudden weight of a body falling beside you. Japanese snipers had turned the terrain into a patient weapon. Palms, ridgelines, shattered huts, even the blackened remains of trees all became places where death could wait without moving. He had arrived with that rifle and a cardboard box of ammunition weeks earlier, transferred in without ceremony. The paperwork said marksman. The men around him saw something else, a civilian-looking weapon bought from the back pages of a magazine, the kind a farm boy might use to hunt deer at dawn. They trusted heavy things, thick wood stocks, military stamps, rifles that felt like iron promises in the hands. This one felt almost polite. The first shot came on the second morning after his arrival, a crack, sharp and sudden, followed by a shout that cut off halfway through the word man. A corporal slumped near the edge of the clearing, helmet rolling once before stopping upside down. No muzzle flash had been seen, no movement, just another body and the same old question hanging in the air, where, they waited, minutes stretched thin, sweat crawled down spines, someone whispered a curse. He did not move at first. He watched the tree line, not with urgency but with attention, as if reading something written too faintly for panic to decipher. His breathing slowed. He shifted his weight just enough to bring the rifle up. The shot he fired did not sound dramatic. It did not echo. It was almost modest. A pause followed, longer than anyone expected, and then a shape loosened itself from the foliage high on a slope and fell, hitting branches on the way down, each impact dull and final. No one spoke. A few men stood without realizing they had stood. The jungle seemed to exhale. Later, someone asked how he knew. He shrugged, not dismissively, just truthfully. Light on a lens, a leaf cut too clean. A pattern that did not belong. He spoke as if describing whether that was one. By the third day, the mocking had stopped entirely. The rifle was no longer a curiosity. It was watched, respected, sometimes even touched when he stepped away, as if the men wanted to feel what kind of object could change the air around a place so completely. He remained unchanged. He ate when told, slept lightly, and spent long hours still, eyes moving while the rest of him stayed quiet. The snipers adjusted. They always did. Shots came from new angles, higher, farther, sometimes absurdly close. A man was hit while boiling water, another while tightening a strap. Each time, the familiar tension returned, thicker now because hope had entered the equation. They had seen it was possible to answer back. On the afternoon heat of the third day, the answer came twice within an hour. The first was nearly invisible, a faint discoloration among rocks where nothing should have reflected at all. The second required patience. He waded through sweat, through the ache in his neck, through the sound of distant gunfire that tried to pull his attention away. When he fired, the pause afterward told the story before the body did. By then, word had spread through the unit without being spoken aloud. Men moved differently when he was nearby. They exposed less of themselves. They trusted the silence a little more. The jungle did not feel friendly, but it felt less owned. The fourth day dawned gray and heavy, rain threatening but never committing. The snipers were desperate now. Desperation made them sloppy but also bold. Shots rang out closer than before, one grazing a shoulder, another punching through a pack. The men hugged the earth. Someone shouted his name. He did not rush. He slid into a position that looked uncomfortable and stayed there. Minutes passed, then more. The rain began at last, softening edges, blurring lines. Through it all, he watched. The final shots of those 4 days came as the light began to fail. one after another, spaced apart not by chance but by certainty. Each time the rifle spoke, and each time the jungle gave something back. When it was over, no one cheered, no one counted aloud. They simply noticed the absence. The oppressive feeling that had pressed against their chests began to lift, not entirely, but enough to breathe. That night, someone finally asked him about the rifle. Why that one? Why trust it? He held it for a moment before answering, fingers resting where the wood met metal. It shoots straight, he said. It does what it's told. No one laughed. They sat with that answer, listening to the rain fade into the darkness, knowing that for 4 days, something simple and overlooked had stood between them and the unseen, and it had not failed. The days that followed did not return to normal, because nothing ever truly returned once it had been interrupted by certainty. The jungle remained the jungle, wet, alive, patient, but the men carried a different weight in their movements. They spoke less about what might happen and more about what had already been survived. His name was used sparingly, almost carefully, as if saying it too often might thin whatever quiet advantage he carried with him. He continued to move through the camp like a visitor who had overstayed nothing. He cleaned the rifle at the same times each day, checked the same small screws and sights, ran his thumb along the stock where the wood had darkened from use. The mocking phrase still existed, but only as a memory now, something faint and embarrassed. When replacements arrived, no one repeated it. They only pointed subtly and said nothing. The island taught lessons slowly, and it punished impatience. On the 6th morning after the 4th day, a new sniper announced himself with a single shot that punched through a crate of rations. Rice spilled onto the mud like pale gravel. The men froze, eyes searched for him. No one asked for help this time. They simply made space. He did not fire back immediately. He watched the way the birds reacted, the way a patch of leaves seemed too still in the breeze. The rifle rested against his shoulder without tension, as though it had always belonged there. When he finally fired, it felt inevitable rather than reactive. The echo barely finished before the distant shape slumped sideways and disappeared from view. No one marked the count anymore. Numbers had lost their meaning. What mattered was the pattern. The jungle no longer spoke without being answered. At night, when the heat loosened its grip just enough for men to sleep, he stayed awake. He listened to the small sounds that most people learn to ignore: insects shifting rhythm, the faint click of cooling metal, the soft human noises that came when men dreamed of places far from water and rot. He did not dream much himself. When he did, it was of open fields, long sightlines, and mornings where the air moved freely. Once, a young private asked him where he learned to shoot like that. The question was not casual. It carried admiration, but also something like disbelief. He thought about it longer than expected. Back home, he said, hunting, long days waiting for nothing to happen, learning that stillness was not the same as doing nothing. The private nodded, not entirely understanding, but accepting it anyway. The officers took notice in their own way. No commendations appeared. No speeches were made. He was assigned where the trouble was thickest, where the lines blurred and men felt watched even while surrounded. Each time the pattern repeated, the first loss, the tightening fear, the slow response, then the quiet correction. The rifle aged quickly in the humidity. The metal dulled. The wood swelled and contracted with the weather. He adapted without complaint. Small adjustments, tiny recalibrations, the kind that never made it into reports. He treated the rifle less like a weapon and more like a tool that required respect rather than faith. One afternoon, during a lull that felt suspiciously generous, he sat with a group of men sharing coffee that tasted faintly of rust. Someone joked, carefully, about ordering another rifle from the same catalog. The laughter that followed was soft and brief, but it was real. He allowed himself a small smile, gone almost as soon as it appeared. The island would not stay quiet forever. None of them expected it to. But for stretches of time, the jungle seemed to pause, as if recalculating. Those pauses mattered. They allowed men to move, to rest, to remember themselves as more than targets. He remained what he had always been, present, observant, unremarkable at first glance. If there was pride in what he did, it never surfaced. He carried the rifle the same way on the first day and the last, not as a statement, but as a responsibility. And in the spaces between gunfire and rain, between orders and waiting, that responsibility shaped the air around him, steady and unspoken, like a line drawn quietly through chaos that refused to blur. Time stretched in unfamiliar ways after that. Weeks passed without anyone marking them properly. The calendar, when it existed at all, was smudged and unreliable, corners soft from damp fingers. Days were counted by patrols, by supply drops, by the changing smell of the air when rain came in heavier than expected. Through it all, he remained constant, a fixed point in a place that refused to hold still. The jungle learned him, or perhaps he learned it. Either way, there was a mutual adjustment. He noticed when the ground sounded hollow under a boot, when a vine had been moved too recently, when a shadow fell in a way that did not match the sun's angle. These were not dramatic revelations. They were quiet recognitions, the kind that came only from long attention. Once, during a patrol along a ridgeline, the men ahead of him stopped abruptly. The air felt wrong, as if it had tightened. He did not raise a hand or give a command. He simply knelt, shifted his position by inches, and waited. A shot rang out moments later, cracking against stone where his head would have been. Before the echo finished, he answered. The reply was short, decisive. The ridge fell silent again, as if embarrassed by its own attempt. After that, the men began to trust pauses. When he stopped, they stopped. When he watched, they watched. Orders still existed, but something older and more instinctive had begun to guide them. It was not superstition. It was pattern recognition shared without words. At night, he sometimes wrote letters he never sent. The paper was scarce, the ink unreliable. He wrote about small things, the way the light filtered through leaves in the morning, the sound of rain on canvas, the odd comfort of routine in a place built on uncertainty. He never wrote about the shots. He never wrote about the bodies. Those things seemed temporary, while the details felt permanent. The rifle became an extension of that routine. He knew its weight even when it was not in his hands. He sensed when something was off by the way it settled against his shoulder. He compensated without thinking, the way one adjusted posture while walking on uneven ground. It did not matter where it had come from. It mattered only that it responded predictably. There were days when nothing happened at all. Those were the hardest. Men fidgeted. Conversations circled the same few topics. The absence of danger made room for imagination, and imagination often proved crueler. He used those days to observe more closely, to test assumptions, to confirm what the jungle allowed and what it did not. On one such day, he noticed a small change near a dried streambed, a log that had not been there before. It looked natural, placed just well enough to pass a quick glance. He watched it for nearly an hour before firing. The shot revealed what patients already knew. Afterward, no one questioned the delay. The officers began to plan around him, though they rarely said so outright. Patrol routes shifted. Positions were held longer. Risks were calculated differently. He was not a symbol, and he did not want to be one. He was simply effective, and effectiveness altered behavior more reliably than inspiration ever could. Eventually, replacements arrived who had not been there at the beginning. They heard the stories secondhand, filtered through understatement. 11 in 4 days became a vague reference, then a quiet fact. When they saw the rifle, they did not laugh. They looked at it the way one looked at something proven, without needing explanation. He never corrected anyone's assumptions. If they thought the rifle special, he let them. If they thought he was, he ignored it. In his mind, there was only preparation meeting opportunity, again and again, without ceremony. The jungle continued to test them, but the tests grew less frequent, less confident. Snipers still appeared, but fewer stayed long. The balance had shifted, not decisively, not permanently, but enough to be felt, enough to change how men slept, how they breathed. One evening, as the light drained slowly from the canopy, a soldier sat beside him and said, quietly, that he was glad he had come. He nodded, accepting the statement without weighing it down with response. Gratitude was another thing that passed through places like this without lingering. When orders eventually came to move on, the camp dismantled itself with practiced efficiency. There were no farewells, no speeches. Just the steady process of leaving one difficult place for another. He packed the rifle last, wrapping it carefully despite its scars, and slung it over his shoulder. As they disappeared back into the green, the jungle closed behind them, erasing tracks, reclaiming space. It would forget them in time, it always did. But for a while there would be stretches of quiet where something remembered caution, where unseen eyes hesitated, where a lesson learned slowly refused to fade too quickly. He walked on without looking back, carrying nothing more than he always had: attention, patience, and a rifle that shot straight and did what it was told. The march away from the island felt longer than the march toward it had ever been. Packs cut into shoulders that had learned to carry weight without complaint. Boots sank into familiar mud one last time, then found firmer ground as the terrain changed, almost reluctantly, as if the earth itself resisted letting them go. He noticed these things because noticing was what he did. Others noticed the absence of shots, the way the air no longer felt aimed at them. They moved through staging areas and temporary camps that blurred together, each one a rearrangement of the same elements: tents, crates, men learning and unlearning habits. Word preceded him in fragments. Not legends, not quite. More like adjustments in tone when his name was mentioned, pauses where questions might have been. The rifle remained what it was, but now it was carried differently by the space around it. In quieter moments, he found himself teaching without meaning to, a suggestion here, a correction there, not instructions so much as observations. Watch the line where shadow meets light. Listen for what stops rather than what starts. Assume nothing wants to be seen. Men absorb these ideas unevenly, but even partial understanding changed outcomes. It always did. There were losses, of course. War did not bargain fairly. He felt each one in the same muted way, a tightening behind the eyes, a brief recalibration of expectations. He did not pretend that skill could erase chance. It could only narrow its reach. On a different stretch of ground, with different trees and a different smell to the soil, the mocking phrase surfaced again, but only briefly, spoken by someone new, someone unaware. It died quickly, smothered not by anger but by a kind of embarrassed silence. The man who had said it glanced around, realized he was alone in the thought, and did not repeat it. He began to notice the rifle's age more clearly. The wear was uneven, telling its own story, tiny nicks along the stock from hurried movement, a faint discoloration where rain had soaked in too deeply. None of it mattered to performance. If anything, the imperfections made it more familiar, easier to trust. Sometimes, during long watches, he wondered what would happen to the rifle after this was over. Whether it would be stored, forgotten, sold, or carried home, he did not dwell on it. Objects followed paths of their own. He had learned not to interfere. There was an operation inland that went poorly at first. The terrain rose unexpectedly, turning clear plans into suggestions. Shots came from angles no one liked. Confusion pressed in hard and fast. He found a position among rocks slick with moss and stayed there while the situation unraveled and then slowly, painstakingly, reassembled itself. The rifle spoke 3 times over the course of an hour. Each time the pressure eased slightly, not enough to celebrate, enough to continue. Afterward, someone asked him how he stayed so calm. He considered the question. Calm, he said, was just what happened when you accepted that fear did not improve accuracy. The answer satisfied no one entirely, but it ended the conversation. The seasons shifted almost imperceptibly. The heat changed character. The rain arrived differently. The jungle never became friendly, but it grew predictable in its unpredictability. He adjusted. He always did. One evening, as they rested near a river swollen with recent storms, he watched the current carry debris past in steady silence. A helmet floated by, turned upside down, catching briefly on a branch before freeing itself and continuing on. He followed it with his eyes until it disappeared. Then he looked back to the bank, to the rifle beside him, to the men nearby speaking in low voices about home. Home felt distant, not in miles but in texture. He could remember it clearly, but it no longer felt immediate. That, he suspected, was temporary. Everything here was temporary, even when it felt endless. When the war eventually loosened its grip on that region, The change came not as relief, but as a gradual thinning of tension. Patrols shortened, watches relaxed slightly, men laughed more easily, then caught themselves doing it, unsure if it was allowed. He remained unchanged, carrying the same habits into a quieter environment. There was talk of rotation, of reassignment. Names were read. He listened without expectation. When his came, he acknowledged it with a nod. The rifle was cleaned thoroughly that night, more carefully than usual, not out of sentiment, but because routines mattered most when circumstances shifted. On the transport away, he sat apart, watching the coastline recede. The jungle became a darker band, then a suggestion, then nothing at all. No one said goodbye to it. No one needed to. The rifle rested across his knees, familiar weight, familiar balance. Whatever waited next would have its own patterns, its own lessons. He would learn them as he always had, slowly, patiently, without announcement. And somewhere behind them, in places where men once watched and waited with too much confidence, there remained a memory of caution, thin but persistent, left behind by a rifle that was never supposed to matter and a man who never needed it to.